So we'll start with the land acknowledgement statement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Know that today's statement does not just apply to the Ho-Chunk, but also the Anishinaabe, the Oneida, the Métis, Sac, Fox, Kickapoo, and others who are also part of this place. Today's guest is Dr. John Baldacchino. Dr. John Baldacchino is Professor of Arts Education. He served as director of UW-Madison's Division of the Arts from 2016 to 2019. He was a member of faculty at Columbia University, New York, and the universities of Dundee, Falmouth, Robert Gordon, and Warwick in Britain. A specialist in art, philosophy, and education, he's authored essays, papers, reviews, and journalistic articles. His studio practice focuses on painting and drawing. He's also authored 14 books, which include Easels of Utopia, published in '98, Education Beyond Education, 2009, Makings of the Sea in 2010, Art's Way Out in 2012, John Dewey in 2014, Art is Unlearning in 2018, and Inducing Ivan Illich in 2020. He is currently working on 2 new volumes. Please welcome Dr. John Baldacchino.
Thank you. So I'm glad to be here with you. And I can tell you that this is a bit of a challenge for me because normally, as you heard, I publish a lot of books, and also for professional reasons and for all sorts of combinations in history and how these things converge, I find myself doing more lectures on other things, including, theory of art, pedagogies and all that stuff, and less about my studio work, because I can't say just my work, because my work consists of a lot of things, which I'm hoping to share with you a bit of. And one of the funny things that happened was that when I shared the site, which was sort of, announcing this lecture, a lot of friends of mine who know me, when they saw this painting of Gramsci, they thought I was going to do a lecture on Gramsci, which I normally do. And I'll tell you who Gramsci is later on. And I told them, no, this is not a lecture on Gramsci. Actually, that thing is one of my paintings. So that's why I showed that. But then I realized that there was an irony here. And I thought, okay, what should I put as a title? And I said, okay, this is not a lecture on Gramsci. Still, people thought that was an ironic statement. And I was going to give a lecture on Gramsci, a bit like, Magritte's and the pipe. No, actually, I'm not giving a lecture on Gramsci. So anyway, so that's the whole idea of it. So it's basically spectacularly failed. But anyway, that's the whole thing. So actually, I like the idea that the portrait is in a way deceptive because it's a portrait, but it's also a painting. And some people, often they don't see the painting, but they see what the painting is supposed to represent. And as you know, you're coming from the arts, the visual arts, you know that that's consistent with everything else. What this is about, what are you doing? Why do you do portraiture? What sort of art do you do? What sort of medium do you use? The other thing which was interesting that some people thought that was pastel, but actually it's quite a big, large oil painting with pastel on it because I can't help messing around with stuff. So I mean, underneath there's acrylic and all sorts of things. I think at the end of the day it will just crack and fall apart. But anyway, that's fine. So I mean, that's to start with. Now let's see how this works. So the question is, what is this lecture about? And also, is it about my research? Is it about my art, my writing, my teaching? As you heard, I do a lot of things. I've been teaching and working in universities, believe it or not, I can't believe it, for the last 30 years. I started teaching, like many of you, as a TA when I was 28. And I ended up teaching actually English literature. Well, so what on earth? I was doing a PhD at Warwick University, which was an arts education department. And we, in arts education, we did literature, we did all sorts of subjects. And there was a TA-ship, and I thought I'll apply for it. And I found myself teaching English literature. It was interesting because I was doing a PhD research on two authors, two philosophers. One was called George Lukács, who wrote massive books on aesthetics, and there was Theodor Adorno. You probably know more about him. And actually, George Lukács dealt more with the visual, with literature rather than the visual arts, and Theodor Adorno dealt more with literature and music. And I found myself in a very interesting situation. I said, okay, I am interested in visual arts. How am I going to bring them together in that? And so teaching literature was very good for me because for those who know about Jacques Rancier's book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, I was actually an ignorant schoolmaster because I didn't know much about the literature. So I was preparing and reading and learning while also preparing to do my TA job. And it was quite an interesting learning experience there. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing. I mean, this is interesting. This is when I was a teacher's college. I used to teach a course, a drawing course for non-specialists. And one of the things we used to do is to use a stick and put a thing and try to draw with it. And I call it bum. You're drawing with your backside, because when you're trying to move, you're actually moving more your backside than when you're moving the stick. So, I mean, I like these photos. Someone took these photographs of me doing this bum drawing. Pardon my French, but in English, it's a very innocent word. So I don't know how it works in American. But, you know, butt drawing, if you want to call it that. And that's interesting because you can't control really what you're doing. But I mean, I really enjoyed that particular class, teaching it, because it became more like the students, most of whom were teachers, adult teachers, some of them my age, engaging in mark making and also working a lot collaboratively. It's one of those joys that I will always remember when I'm teaching, especially if you're teaching like something like that. But the big question is, what do I do? And I don't think it's bad to say I'm not really sure. So if I'm trying to define what I do, it's a bit of a challenge. And it's a challenge which kept me going. So, I mean, in my career, I worked in various contexts. You're here in an art department within a school of education, which is very strange. You don't find that much. And yet the art department, I keep calling it school because it acts almost like it has that autonomy, is even though it is within the education school, it acts like a small art school, partly because there are areas, it has the autonomy that it needs, and it works in a way that it works with the education part, but also it works as entirely on its own in terms of what it teaches. So basically, that's an interesting context. I was in situations where, for example, being in an art education department within an education school, where we had to do more in terms of trying to frame what we did, especially coming from practice, how to frame that within the education context of it, which was really difficult because we had students who were art teachers, but we also had students who were artists. And they used to do, for example, an EDD, a doctorate into teaching of College of Art. This was in New York. I used to be in art schools, straightforward art schools, where then part of my remit was also to look after how we teach there, but also teaching contextual critical studies, straightforward, which we also included within studios. So we pushed the envelope, if you like, in order to be able to engage critique and theory, which used to be just art historical, within the studio. So, I mean, there were a lot of boundaries within which I had to work and which I had to push. And all my career, I always remember, and I always think of how that kind of challenge of working within boundaries, but also pushing these boundaries and going outside these boundaries was my kind of the thing which really pushed me to continue doing what I was doing. The requirements were interesting. What was expected of you? Were you expected to write books? Were you expected to do shows? And you had to make choices because you couldn't just try to do both because you won't be able to do it. You know, I know if you're going to do studio only and you have to work really on shows and all that stuff, that's a job in itself. But if you're going to publish books, you're going to go into the conference circuit, that's another job in itself. And you cannot possibly do both. So, I mean, the reason why I found myself having to make decisions, and also what is expected of you in terms of tenure, in terms of other measurements, which, for example, in Britain, you'll find every 5 years, they will ask you, what sort of research are you doing, is interesting. So, however, having said that, my engagement with the boundaries also informed some of the work that I did in terms of my own writing. And this is what I'm saying is, doing art, I seek also to exit into the world. And exit meaning pushing boundaries and moving beyond the boundaries. And we know that in this world, especially in this day and age, the idea of boundaries are sometimes very cruel. The idea of boundaries, those who come from outside, the foreigners, those who don't have the papers. In France, they call them, people sans papier, who don't have the paper, as in quote unquote illegal immigrants. So the whole idea of the foreigner, the whole idea of exiting the boundaries of the city is interesting, because the city keeps you within the boundaries, keeps you safe, but also it keeps you outside the world. So, I mean, inside you're protected, but also you're suppressed in. So the whole dimension of that, that's why I wrote a book called Art's Way Out, which deals with this whole kind of relationship, is how art itself reflects that kind of struggle of being within and outside. Or as the Scots would say, out with. It's how to be out with, but into the world. And for those who come from a Christian tradition would remember how the apostles in Pentecost, they exited into the world. So there's an interesting concept there of how to exit into something bigger. And that's what basically this is all about. So this is big, when I was thinking about this, I said, oh my God, how am I going to explain everyone what do I do? Started feeling like I'm doing a presentation for a job interview. So, okay, I'm an arts practitioner and I'm also an educator. That's fine. And I taught in two British American universities, and so 4 universities in Britain, including 2 art schools. And that's important. Working with an art school is very different from just working in the university. And I mean, I learned a lot from that experience. But also I work a lot with other colleagues. I have big network, and I currently work also with colleagues in Western Norway University, where I'm professor too, which means that basically you're like a visiting professor. Doesn't impinge on your job, but it's kind of something which you do in your own time. But also I do a lot of work with the faculty of fine arts in Porto, and I've been working with them over 10 years. And I also sometimes supervise their doctoral students who are doing arts by practice. So I mean, I keep doing that, and that's quite an interesting engagement. Porto is interesting because it's linked to Brazil, so they have that kind of cover of the Latin American context and how people look at the arts there, but also how they bring in the arts into the community, into schools, all sorts of stuff, which really is a very interesting dynamic to work with. But also, if you want to put it together in 4 areas, I work within the arts, obviously visual arts, creative arts, philosophy, education, and also Mediterranean studies. And I'll explain that hopefully very soon. What is that? That has to do with my own, where do I come from? So as was mentioned, there were 14 books. I'm still working on others. And I wanted to show them to you because I work on them like I do with paintings. So, I mean, it's a bit like, I could say, these are the shows which I've done and the chapters in them and how I go about them. Some people ask me, what sort of methodology do you use when you're writing? I say the same methodology we use in the studio. Now, obviously, if we're talking to someone who does work in the studio, they understand you. Others don't. And that's another thing. When we talk about arts methods, especially within an institutionalized context like a university, we are also fighting, pushing boundaries, trying to create new spaces in order for people to understand, but also to some extent to legitimize the what we call arts practice as research. And in a way that works the other way around for me, because having been trained, having been educated as an arts practitioner, a lot of that methodology of making in the studio, of doing art in the studio, I find it as very useful. I find it as very pertinent to the way I write, to the way I engage, to the way I organize my projects. So I will talk about these things more specifically because I would probably categorize them in 3 areas. But I mean, for the time being, I also like looking at them. I'm also very proud of a couple of the last 2 books towards the end were designed by my daughter, who is a graphic designer. So I mean, it's a kind of really interesting life project, if you like. And as it was said, I mean, I'm working at the moment on 2 new books. There might be another one, but again, it's a bit like when you're saying how many, what sort of projects you're doing. You say, well, I have 2 or 3 paintings going on at the same time. Some of them are being there, and then I'm picking them up, and then suddenly they become more actual than others. And it's the same process. To me, it's very, very similar. So again, from my job interview, so I had professorial and leadership positions. When I came here, actually, I came as director of the Arts Institute, which then I changed into the Division of the Arts, and I kind of reformed it. And after 3 years doing that, I felt that I needed to go back to my teaching and my own research, and that's why I'm here. So, I mean, it's interesting how those kind of processes work, and also what you learn from that thing. So, but I also held positions elsewhere as Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning and all that stuff. Again, within the context of the arts, it's a really exciting thing to do for a while. So, but I also taught in elementary schools. I mean, I trained for historical reasons in Malta, where I was born and lived until I was in my 20s. The university there, at that point in the history, we couldn't do degrees which were not linked to a profession. So the closest that could be, I wanted to do either philosophy or art. The closest was becoming a teacher. So I found myself doing philosophy and art within an educational degree, which took 5 years. It was quite big. So, I mean, there's that kind of interesting connection with the schools, which is really interesting. Although these days, if you think about what the kind of area of education that I focus on, it's more to do with the art school. It's more to do with how we teach in higher education, how we teach in universities. But, I still connect with a lot of colleagues and students who are preparing to become teachers as well. So I published about the arts, and I told that, but I mean, and also, I engage a lot with national and international networks, partly because I also believe in this virtual university, which is across boundaries, where we work, a lot of people who connect with each other across the boundaries of different universities in different countries. And that's a very important thing. One of my old professors taught me that, because I, restless and become nervous sometimes, told me, John, there's no ideal university. The only ideal university is the one you make through your connections. And that's something I learned from him, and I keep passing it on to everyone else, that there's that kind of, and this also, networks are very much appreciated by universities anyway. So, I mean, it forms part and parcel of what we do. So I also engage with the outer world. I do a lot of work in terms of, as you see there, I've done, but also I do journalistic writing. I'm still connected with Malta in some way or another. There were periods where I still did cartoons for them and also wrote journal until 4 years ago. And these days with social media, actually, you can live in different worlds at the same time. So, I mean, I'll talk a bit about that soon. So, as I said, when I was a student, like you, back in the 80s, I used to do a lot of cartoons, and I was very much engaged with politics, and local politics of Malta, and that's Maltese. So, I mean, this is what I was involved in a youth, socialist youth. This is Europe. Don't get scared with this word. Okay, and I couldn't help sort of, I'm always very critical of institutions. I mean, it's just like Groucho Marx. If people ask me, I remind me like Groucho Marx. I hate institutions. I don't want to join institutions which I'm a member of. So I couldn't help criticizing them. And my institute, that institution is a political institution, and they kind of really almost like kicked me out. So I remember doing these cartoons on a journal, because this one, exit means exit means thought, thinking. And I remember I did a whole paper about article having a big fight with them, and I did myself those days being hit by the gods, and the gods are telling me, no, the gods don't exist. This is heresy. So I used to do a lot of covers for this magazine, and in those days, for those of you who are graphic designers, we didn't do color separation with the computers. We had to do them manually. And the link with that, my father was a printer all his life, since he was 15. And actually, he taught me how to do color separation and all that stuff manually. So I did a lot of that stuff. So work with Indian ink and then do all these transparencies and all that stuff. So, I mean, I knew how to do that. That's another example of, writing and all that stuff. So, I mean, there's a lot of engagement with politics. Much more recently, I started doing a whole series for a Maltese newspaper. I don't do it anymore. The word bozillis in Maltese is a very strange word, which means it's a dilemma. We're in a pickle. It's a kind of, we're in trouble. And as you could see, hiding under the umbrella of truth and the hierarchy of whatever. But that one, that's Charlie Hebdo, do you remember, the French? But that one thing with St. Joseph and Mary, pregnant Mary, on the boat, that made itself to the Vatican because the Archbishop of Malta liked it so much that they wanted me to do one, sign it, and he sent it to the Pope. So, but I mean, Tama means hope. So this is linked actually with the plight of the refugees, who drowned basically in the Mediterranean. So I mean, that was a Christmas thing, so to speak. That Mary and Joseph were fleeing, like the refugees, and also trying to find refuge on a boat. So I mean, I'm quite proud of that thing. And what is interesting with cartoons is that what you can say in 6 pages, you can say it just in an image. And obviously, cartoon allow me to do things visually, which I find really satisfying because I can do a lot, and I can engage with ideas without having to explain much. So I mean, cartooning, probably looking back at cartoons and looking back at my art, which you will see, there is a kinship to them, and there is quite a link in terms of figuration there. But I mean, that's up to you. So, so what do I do? Well, I think that by doing art, I'm also engaged in a continuous form of unlearning. And this is linked also to one of my recent books called Art as Unlearning. And some of you might, I know a couple of you might have come to one of my classes on pedagogies. I consider unlearning as one of the artistic pedagogies that we use in art schools. Unlearning is not more, it's not to me, it's not new because it comes from, we use the word a lot when we're doing studio. When we're teaching, I don't know, drawing, we're teaching live drawing, we're teaching how to unlearn what you come with and start looking at what you're in front of you. I mean, I always have 2 examples of unlearning. One is to do with faith, that often we think of a deity as the old man upstairs. And we make it human, and we don't understand that because when we grow up, because you're taught in one way when you're a kid, and then when you grow up, even if, I mean, whether you believe or you don't, you have to unlearn that stuff and not relearn, but you have to kind of, engage with the stuff, which is very difficult to understand in a form of unlearning. But also, the more familiar approach to unlearning is, say, for example, when you're doing live drawing and you have a model, the first thing you tell your students, at least I do, is forget the ideal model of the figure in your head. Start looking at what is in front of you. And that takes a lot of ways of how to unlearn, because for some of developmental reasons, we also tend to do outlines and then fill it in. If you look at, as you're working with kids, for example, the way they see things, the way they develop drawing is there is a particular pattern which they all follow. So there must be something to do with developmental issues to do with that. I'm not a psychologist, but I remember my developmental psychology when I was a student, and it says, there are certain developmental theories of how we view things, like Lowenfeld, who says at certain age, we see things in a certain way. For example, one of the big examples is how kids look at perspective and how they don't see perspective as we then try to rationalize it, but they want to bring in details. For example, I used to go with my daughter to do, go somewhere and do some drawing of what we see. She felt less nervous than me because she could put everything she would see in her picture, in her drawing. I can't. I have to sort of, measure everything. And I felt jealous because I felt I wish I had that kind of freedom which my daughter had. So in a way, I could have said, okay, I want to unlearn. And that's what, naive artists do. That's what artists in the Mannerist period did. They said, why not unlearn all that stuff and look in a different way? So unlearning becomes central especially in my recent work, and I'm engaging a lot with colleagues. I have a colleague of mine in Norway who does a lot of work on indirect pedagogy. He comes from literature, and we found that there is a kinship between unlearning and indirectness. So, I mean, there's a lot of that stuff going on in terms of what I do, but I think reflecting back on my work, my artwork, I think there's a lot of that as well, as I will show you, happening in my own studio work. I keep pushing back in order to unlearn what I was very keen on when I was a younger artist. Speaking of the younger artist, so that's when I was an undergrad, just graduated, and that's one of my big paintings in those days. I was actually trained as a painter. I also studied sculpture. I used to study all sorts of other things, but I mean, the major ones were painting and sculpture, but we had to do also other printmaking and stuff like that, because we were also trained to become teachers. So we were the artists, but then we had also the teaching degree. So there were like 2 degrees. It's a bit like in America, you would say I've majored in two areas, but and there we didn't call it that. And I was very influenced by Italian avant-garde. Malta is a very strange place because actually being a British colony for a long, long time, during the Knights of St. John, all the major artists in Europe were there because the knights were aristocrats and they used to bring, so Caravaggio was there. So it was in tune with what was going on in Europe. But historically then, when it became a British garrison, after the French spent 2 years and that was it, Malta was cut out from the rest of Europe because it became a fortress. So I mean, a lot of that had an impact on art. And we became modernists, so to speak, only after independence in the 60s. So, I mean, there was a kind of a dislodgement. If you look at even at literature, for example, when Maltese literature was developing, and there's such a thing as a Maltese language, it was much more influenced by the Italian Romanticists at a time when, the Dadaists were doing what they were doing, when the Futurists were doing what they're doing. So, I mean, there's always that kind of strange, I wouldn't say disalignment of history, but definitely the whole idea of a history as being sort of one long thing following each other in the Mediterranean, that notion is thrown out. So I mean, when people talk about postmodernity, I kind of smile because postmodernity, we lived it all the time there. And I mean, I wrote a book about Mediterranean aesthetics called Makings of the Sea, and that's the argument that actually, people like Jean-François Lyotard who wrote about the postmodern condition, actually, when you read him, you realize that he's talking about those kind of sort of elements which were already and continue to be within certain regions like the Mediterranean. It's the order of the day. It's always there. There's the idea of progress in history becomes a myth. Anyway, so that's me. Now, just in case you wonder, where on earth is Malta? There are various Maltas in the United States, but those are little cities or little towns. This one is the real thing. So that thing there, the small island, is in the middle. You could see Sicily there. You could see Tunis, and somewhere here Libya. And you could see how it's right in the middle of the Mediterranean. That place is a republic. It's got its own language. It's independent. It used to be British for 200 years, but I mean, just about everyone in the history of the Mediterranean was there. Our language, which was never the official language until recently, as in the modern era, is a mix of Sicilian, Italian Sicilian, and Arabic. And it's a very interesting, it's the only Semitic language in the European Union, official language. And there's a lot of that. So, I mean, you can imagine why then growing up there, the kind of Mediterranean imaginary becomes so strong. I thought I'll put a map here because often people are polite to me when I say I come from Malta or Malta, and they look at me and say, yes. I only know one person who's Maltese in Wisconsin. I'm sure there are, in the state of Wisconsin, I'm sure there are a lot of them, but I mean, I only know one. If you go to New York City, then there's a Maltese center and there are a lot of migrants. I mean, actually the Maltese are migrants as well. You find them all over the place. But there is that kind of, kinship. It used to be part of the Kingdom of Sicily for a long, long time. So the language was also Italian. So you had Arabic, Italian, and then in the British came. So you have all this kind of segmentation of different languages. There are 2 official languages there, Maltese and English. But we also speak Italian, and we have to learn things like French at school and all that stuff. So I mean, that's for you to understand. If you see the picture there, Malta is full of Baroque, Mannerist, and all manners of churches and art in such a small place. So if you want to go to somewhere where you really have a lot of kind of heritage there, it's quite an interesting place for that. And also there is some of the oldest buildings known to humankind in Europe there, like 4,000 before the Common Era and all that stuff. So I mean, it's so you're brought up in that kind of environment, you can imagine. So, as I told you, Italian Futurism was a big influence on me. But recently, I was asked to write a commentary for the Studies in Art Education, is one of those major journals in America. And I wrote a piece which I called Squaring the Arts Quandary. And I kept thinking about what happens when we're dealing with the arts, especially in institutionalized contexts like universities or like schools or any institution you can imagine where the arts are used. And I say used, sometimes they are, become instrumental, which is not always a good thing. So one of the things which I thought about is, you're bound to be, if you're going through this kind of, life, and you do jobs related to art, you're bound to be an artist, you're bound to be an art educator, you're bound to be an educator of artists, but also you're bound to be an administrator every now and then for your sins. And I thought, okay, I've done all these. So I was thinking about them. And then you go back to be either the artist or you go back to be, the professor or whatever, after doing the administration thing. So, I know a lot of colleagues who do that. Some of them actually are old enough to retire early and then they just go back to their studio. So, there's kind of an interesting dynamic going on. But the other concepts which I would put together would be, we're talking about exiting, which I already explained. But also we're talking about heteronomy, or the relationship between heteronomy and autonomy. Art is autonomous, but art also sparks off other things. So there's the heteronomy and autonomy, which are working together. There's also exiting and immanence. Immanence is the interiority of art. One of my favorite arguments is, which is not new, but there is a school of thought which always argues that art is immanent. Art is, it's got its own interiority. Sometimes we say art is immanently pedagogical. Art is not being thought as an instrument of something else, but actually in and of itself, as art, it becomes pedagogical because it's formative. So, and then there is also unlearning and teaching. So you're teaching, but imagine you're teaching and adopting pedagogies which are informed by notions of unlearning or indirectness. And if you start sort of connecting them like that, I tried to, I'm not very good with diagrams, but I thought, well, all these things have been flying in my head all the time I've been teaching. How do I connect them? So we talked about something which what we call art. The way I'm trying to approach it, at least in my work, and also in my own professional work, so theoretical work, artistic, studio-based work, and professional work, is a bit like this. This could change, but it's like a snapshot. So, and that's important because that helps me understand also why do I do what I do. So if I'm traveling through research as my art and art as my research, so I'm embracing art's aporia. Aporia is, in the old Greek context, aporia is like a gate where it is shut. So it's a gate which invites you in, but you can't go in. You have to go in by either the exit side and you walk back. Someone actually described aporia as going through a labyrinth where you don't even have Ariadne's thread, so you're lost. But what you do is you have to go through the labyrinth backwards in order to find your way out, if there is a way out. So others would say aporia is very similar to a paradox. But anyway, so I embrace art's paradox, if you like, and its historical contingencies, its historic limitations, historic accidents, if you like, by which we then define ourselves and gain freedom. And this is also linked to some of the stuff I write about in terms of how limits, historical limits, things which you don't expect to happen, things which you don't know what's going to happen, those should be embraced, by which then we can think of freedom. And this is related to things like theories which come out of Dewey, theories which come out of pragmatism, but also approaches which I wrote about, for example, when I was at Teachers College at Columbia. I was very lucky to still meet and work with an old professor who's called Maxine Green. And I recommend her work. If she was still alive now, she would be over 100. So she was already in the 90s then. And that's like more than 10 years ago. And I found myself writing a book about her. But one of the things which Maxine talks about is how you approach the world. She talks about approaching a classroom or approaching anything as a stranger. You become a stranger to what you know. This whole relationship between what is familiar and what is familiar. Again, unlearning the familiarity in order to be able to look at it with different eyes. So it's those kind of relationships, but also accepting the unfamiliar, the unexpected, and embracing it. And I personally think that through the visual arts, or by doing art more than making, it's one of the most optimum situations which you can do that. I mean, when people say, how can you explain that practically in certain things? So, well, maybe I can't explain it to you as an engineer, but I can explain it to you through what I do in the visual arts or in the creative arts. So, I mean, that opens up a lot of possibilities. So I promised you to look at my work. And at this stage, what I did is look at them in 3 categories. So there's this kind of, so there are these books which I wrote, which are moved by the whole idea of arts, philosophical and formative conversations. And in them, there is the notion of utopia, for example. Eases of Utopia is a book which actually studies or connects or compares the British avant-garde with elements of the Italian avant-garde. British avant-garde, including people like Spencer and others, who are not actually fitting in with the historical avant-garde as you found in Europe. But then elements of the Italian avant-garde, I would say more Boccioni and Carrà, who are much more of the anarchist side than, say, the others who are more fascistic. So, I mean, there's that kind of element there. And I bring in a lot of stuff. For example, I look at them also from perspectives which you'll find in medieval philosophy. I mean, it's all actually, when you read it, it's all visual to me. And I read it as if I wrote it as if I'm writing, as if I'm painting. So basically, there is a lot of that. Avant nostalgia is much more experimental. And I can send you a PDF of that because we produced that for the European League of the Institute of the Arts conference, and we gave it for free. When I say we, it's because the images are composite images done digitally by my colleague, Jeremy Diggle, who also was my boss in Scotland. So, I mean, we worked together on this, and it was quite interesting. I just did text, and then we decided to fill in, put spaces in with his own images, and not necessarily connect them with each other. And the result came really interesting. But Art's Way Out and Art and Unlearning, which are kind of almost like follow each other in a way, even though between them there are different books, are books which I'm really fond of, because if you look at them and you can find bits and pieces, I mean, Art's Way Out is in the library, both of them are in the library. Art's Way Out, I think it's also, you can look at it electronically. It's this whole idea of exiting, which I was talking about. And I bring in various artists in there, but also I bring in a lot of philosophers, and also I bring in literature, as in, you know, Garcia Lorca, but also people like mystics, like Carmelite mystics, like John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Edith Stein. And again, these are opportunities for me to really explore different possibilities. And I mean, I could do 3 lectures on that or more, whole course if you like, but I mean, at the moment, I'm just introducing them to you. But I also wrote books which dealt with one author or one philosopher. That's Max Aingrain. I also wrote a small book about John Dewey. I was asked to write a 100-pager about Dewey, and you know, so many books about John Dewey, but I wanted to approach these authors, who are very well known and many things have been written to them, in a slightly different way. So what I did, I found myself developing a different methodology in terms of approaching these authors. In fact, at the moment, I'm writing a book about 16th century philosopher called Giambattista Vico, who talks a lot about form and knowing in the same way. And I claim that I'm seeing with them, and I imagine myself, I'm sitting by them, they are looking at the world, they are reading those books, they're engaging with what they're engaging with, and I'm sitting and looking at the same text that they are looking. So when I'm doing research, I look at what they were writing, not only what they were writing, but also what they were reading before they wrote what they wrote. So I try to get into their mind. So these are not biographies, but they're more to do with an intellectual kind of approach. And the latest one is Van Illich. And I try to reveal stuff which actually no one else cares to engage with, just to give a different perspective. But then there's also the Mediterranean aspect, which I talked about, which came out of these. And if you notice the last one, it's written in Maltese, and that was my first, that was published last year. My very first ever book written in Maltese, writing philosophy. When we learned philosophy in Maltese, like we learn mathematics, when we learn everything else, I learned it in English. So I can't imagine mathematics. When I taught kids mathematics, I had to teach it in English. And I remember doing experiments of teaching them concepts of numeracy in Maltese. And they just got it. But I mean, in English, it was really difficult because even when I was a kid, I remember struggling with concepts of numeracy in another language. So I decided to write philosophy in Maltese, which I've never written in Maltese, because I read all the books in either Maltese or Italian, sometimes French. And that's an interesting concept in itself. And it became much more existentially speaking, became really, really interesting. And again, I'm actually giving a lecture on that on Zoom next week, because we were going to launch it last year, but we couldn't because of COVID. So, but anyway, the one besides it is a book actually, which is edited by colleagues from the Mediterranean who are practicing artists, but also they teach. So, I mean, looking at Mediterranean art as a, in education and all that stuff. But Makings of the Sea is actually intended to be a trilogy, first book of 3 on Mediterranean aesthetics. And there you will find, at the moment, that one is much more from Southern Europe. So I'm looking at artists, literary artists, visual artists, from Spain, from Italy, from Greece, from the Balkans. So, I mean, again, it was really a delight just engaging with it. These things are a bit like paintings. When you want to do a whole exhibition or a show, say, I want to do a set of paintings about something. And that's how they emerge, these books for me. I say, I want to write a book about Mediterranean aesthetics. What I'm going to do, let's go mess around, do the same research you do. And that's how it works. So I'm an artist, am I an academic, I'm a teaching art, I don't know. But given that art's character is immanent, as I said, it's formative, but it's also autonomous. And autonomy is something which I engage with a lot. Recently, we've done a special edition of a journal in education about education's autonomy. And I approached it from autonomy of art. And I argue that art and education, they're both autonomous forms, they're both autonomous activities, but they somehow have to work together, even though they are autonomous. So there's that kind of conflict all the time. And when you feel that you are in a conflict when you're working with an institution, not this university, but any other institution, there's always that conflict. That's a good thing, in my opinion. So maybe we're all of this stuff, or maybe we're nothing. So I'm just now going to do the image bits and show you a bit of my art, which I have to say, I'm really, really, I had a problem. The first time I did my big show after I graduated, I come from a small island, so you can understand that. There were a couple, I mean, it was really well received and everything, but there were a couple of artists who were really critical of me, and they told me, and I was young, and I got really traumatized. And I decided, I said, that's it, I'm not going to do any shows anymore. I don't care. That's it. I'm just going to paint and not show my work. I mean, I did a couple of shows, but I remember, when I did those 2 were there. These are huge paintings. And someone told me, but you're copying the futurists. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm influenced by them, but actually I want to be in their mind. And I said, yeah, but we're living in 1980s. These were, early 1900s. Why on earth are you doing that? So I'm not afraid of influence, to be honest. But anyway, maybe there was a point, maybe there isn't. But I mean, you find yourself thrown into this kind of anxiety of influence, as Harold Bloom would call it, that you are very anxious, either of not being part of an influence or of being too influenced by someone else. So, and as an undergrad, I see this happening with undergrads all the time. And I think it's healthy that we do that. So, I mean, that kind of relationship. But I mean, the subject was interesting as well, because in those days, I was really preoccupied with the idea that even though the relationship between form and content in art, I always believed that I shouldn't become a formalist. Now, remember, I was very much influenced by the left, and the whole idea of being a formalist was something which kind of still resonated in my head. If you do art history, you realize what I'm talking about, and I'm sure you know about it. So I thought, if I'm using form, it has to convey something. So I mean, the top one is basically about revolution. It's called The Last Judgment, Revolution. And you see elements there of also, I mean, you could sort of, you could live with that forever. The second one, but is much more Freudian. And you can see where the influences are coming from. Eros versus Thanatos, Freud talks about the drive, the love instinct and the death instinct. And we're kind of always struggling between the two. I have to say, I'm still very fond of those paintings. But anyway, so you can see where I'm coming from formally. And then I became more and more interested in, again, the Mediterranean geography, the Mediterranean kind of formation that was always there. But also being from an island where we were fairly homogeneous, which means we came from all over the world. So actually, basically, you've got a melting pot. I always thought about, I was always reading Martin Luther King and all this. I never set step in America in those days. And I was kind of, up here, very much engaged with the idea of otherness. And I remember I wasn't even sure what to call this painting because I thought this would be problematic to call it The Black Within Me. Is that the right title? So I'm still, but I left it there because for you to see what's going on. But I mean, these days I'm more appreciative of the form and also, and you could see I was very disciplined in my painting. So I mean, I was brought up in a very traditional way in terms of how you paint with the glazing and all that stuff. You know, you can't throw in. I had a painting professor who would tell you, cover a part of it, what's that doing there? So I mean, you suddenly start scratching your head. Why did I do that? So I mean, it's very academic kind of training. There's also the other element in there, and these are small sketches. These are watercolors, but also mixed media. But the whole idea of Venus, obviously, you know, young, you're thinking about not just sexuality, but you're also thinking about the figure, the human figure, and all of that. I'm just throwing them in. I mean, these things speak for themselves. I had a lot, but I didn't want to put all of them because I'll give you a headache. But I just want to show you how this challenge for me, this lecture is a challenge because I'm looking back at where I am now and why, how does that link to what I've written? There is a strong element here which has to do with Mediterraneity in terms of body colors, but also what prompts me to look at these kind of images and do these images. In fact, these form part of what I call Mediterranean sketches because of the colors, because of the element of it and all of that. But I was also interested in a lot of music. And this one is actually influenced by, we used to work, my wife is a musician, and we worked a lot with a Maltese composer who was very specialized in Mediterranean music. I ended up writing a whole dissertation for my master's actually on aesthetic identity and the case of the Mediterranean music. And I remember painting this for a friend of ours, which was actually basically, it was all influenced by music. So how would I do that? It's quite a big painting, that one. The other one then also reflects another side of me, which is theology. Because when I was a kid, I was 17, I was going to become a priest. And then I left. I mean, if you come from a Catholic background, you would understand that. You normally either want to become a priest and then leave and you join the Communist Party or something like that. So, I mean, that's kind of situation. But I mean, that kind of formative element in my education, I used to go to a Carmelite school, really still affects me actually in terms of my thinking. And actually it helped me a lot as a methodology. So you could see, but now recently, since I've been doing more and more paintings, and you could see the struggle between going back to where I came from. It's almost instinctual. You start painting future stuff or painting in a certain way, the kind of much more formative rock formation and stuff like that, but also how you push the form. And the form has become more and more insistent on me. I'm not worried about the form being a formalist anymore. I say, yeah, well, actually, the form conveys stuff. So, I mean, these are kind of things, these are this big painting, not that huge, but they do emerge, and these take a long time because, I mean, underneath there are 2 or 3 other paintings. That's how I work. It's a bit like books. The books are a bit like the paintings. You just leave them there, and then you look at them again, turn them upside down, start painting on them again. And suddenly they evolve into something else. Again, Eccetas and Quietas. Eccetas mean thisness, Quietas is whatness. I use those concepts a lot in terms of how we engage with art critically. But again, you could see the color scheme, and I'm always worried about the color. So maybe it's too bright, maybe it's a bit carnivalesque, I don't know. But there is that kind of element, and I'm becoming I used to be more preoccupied with it, but now I'm less preoccupied. Just throw it and see what happens. The notion of the city is something which I carried with me. This is an old one. This is fairly, and that was recent. That's like a year ago. But the whole idea of the city is interesting. I mean, I wrote about a lot, and I'm still obsessed with this poet called Constantin Kafavis, who was a Greek poet, and he talks about Ithaca and how you're going around in life trying to find this Ithaca, this city. You're traveling to the city, but then you realize that the city is within you. And the more you travel to find the city, the more you realize you're not going to find the city because the city is within you. And there's a notion of homecoming, which is basically going back home. But the home is within you. I mean, I've lived all over the place. So, I mean, basically, it's like a migrant life. And it's that kind of transience. And yet the city seems to be, to me, again, something which keeps coming up. So every now and then, I find myself painting the city, which is very Mediterranean, as you could see. It could be in Spain, whatever. However, recently, I found myself doing yeah, before that, when I lived in Scotland, Scotland became very part of me. I mean, it was funny. When I was in Scotland, I never did landscapes in Scotland. I lived in a place where the landscape was so powerful that I remember driving the first time. I almost had an accident because I was so taken by the landscape. I don't know where I was going. But then when we left Scotland, went to New York, lived in New York. At first, New York was like, where am I? And I started painting Scottish landscapes. It's kind of a strange thing. But then I realized how the landscape becomes part of your memory and you carry it with you. I mean, probably these days, I'm very much inclined to start painting New York landscapes. But again, the landscapes to me allow me to do certain things, but these are not real landscapes, and yet they are real. I've seen those places, but they're not the exact places, if you know what I mean. But again, they allow me to do certain things. We can talk about, the marking and the layering and all that stuff. Again, it's a very strong preoccupation for me because as someone who's trained as a painter, it's very difficult to unlearn those things. But I mean, painting itself pushes you to keep on learning what you've got. So you're never happy. You're never sure. You go and mess around it even after 10 years. Now, recently, I've been keeping, I've been doing strange stuff. And I hate, when I was a kid, when I was young, I hated flowers and still lives and all that stuff. So what the hell are these? But these days I found myself doing this stuff. And I'm thinking that it's almost like banal sometimes, but I mean, giving in to that, it's allowing me to explore forms in a different way. These are just cheap watercolors, by the way, but I read and ink. So I mean, there's nothing, no big deal. I think that one over there is just crayon, so a mix of everything. But I'm thinking of these, at the moment they look big, actually they're small. I keep thinking if I have large canvases and I can project them and then paint them in oils or acrylic, I mean, I wonder how would they look like. So I kept pushing this a bit more. These are bigger ones. And again, if you asked me 2 years ago, would you paint flowers? I said, "Don't go away." I mean, what the hell? I mean, why should I do flowers? I mean, it's just not. I mean, here I am, I'm doing this. I'm aware of the time. But another challenge is portraiture. These are big paintings like this. And that's Maxine Greene, who I talked about, and this is Antonio Gramsci. Now, Antonio Gramsci, if you check him, is one of the most important theorists, probably of the 20th century in Italy. Again, we're in America here, land of McCarthy, so I'm going to scare you. This guy founded the Communist Party of Italy in the 20s. He was a very interesting man. He was a young man from Sardinia. He was also he was disabled, had problem with the spine. He was a brilliant man. And he lived in Sardinia, which was like the outpost of Italy. And then he found himself going to Italy at the time where it was what we call the red season, where there used to be a lot of strikes in the early 20s. And he went to study in Turin. It was brilliant. And he founded this group, which then eventually became the Communist Party of Italy, which doesn't exist anymore. Now, the Communist Party of Italy, don't be scared of it. It's one of those kind of herbivorous parties, which actually was very convergent point of any great artist you can imagine in Italy. Fellini, Guttuso, all of them, Pasolini, they were all at some point converging in the Communist Party of Italy. In Italy, you had either the Catholic Church or the Communist Party. And Gramsci was considered to be the one who actually was the kind of, their hero. He ended up in a fascist prison and died very young. But I mean, he wrote what are called the quaderni, the prison notebooks. And actually in them, there is this, because he wrote a lot of stuff, he didn't have the library there, so he had to do a lot of stuff from his memory. And the commentary in the quaderni, in the prison notebooks, are just wonderful. And they have changed the way we look at culture, they have changed the way we look at the arts, the way we look at education and everything. So Gramsci is like, this treasure trove. If you know Pete Buttigieg is Maltese name. His father actually translated Gramsci's notebooks for Columbia University Press. His father used to work at what's it called, Notre Dame. He died recently. So, but Gramsci has always been central to the way we looked at things. Partly because being from the Mediterranean, he talked a lot about the Mediterranean, what he called the Questione del Mezzogiorno, which is the question of the South. And there's some really interesting stuff about his work, which is really, so forget about, because someone told me, oh, but you founded the Communist Party of Italy. I go, do you know what the Communist Party of Italy was? I said, no. So, I mean, don't, you know. But I mean, when I was a kid, when I was in the university, I used to talk about Gramsci all the time. So I used to call him, I had big hair and small specs like him. They used to call me Gramsci as well. So, I mean, but I mean, I wanted to do some portraiture, and I really still want to challenge myself with portraiture. But as you see, there is a huge tension. These are works in progress in terms of where am I going with them. And I wanted to show them to you both as what they represent, but also as paintings. And this is why this lecture is not about Gramsci. So I can do some more lectures on Gramsci and Maxine Greene, open them to everyone, come and engage. And last but not least, I thank you so much. Any questions? I think we kept within the hour, no? We kept the hour, more or less. Good. I'm not very good at that. That's what I look like without the mask. Yes, let me wear the specs where I can see people. Yes.
I was wondering about your cartoon comic illustrations and when you started doing them and if they kind of provided outlet compared to like very theoretical. Like, is it fun or is it like?
Yeah. Yeah, I did cartoons. As I said, I started doing cartoons when I was, well, your age, probably younger, when I was an undergrad. We used to do a lot of stuff. In those days, you know, we didn't have internet, so we used to do what they called, these days I realized we used to do zines a lot, or zine. And we used to do, well, how can I explain what a gestadner is? But I mean, we used to do all sorts of things. And I used to do a lot of cartoons. But also, the cartoons actually started quite interestingly for me because I could do things with cartoons, but then I could write, you know, limericks and stuff like that. And they worked. And then someone told me, would you like to do this for the newspaper? So I used to do it under a pseudonym. It was very funny because I used to make fun of the leader of the opposition a lot. And once I met him and he didn't know who I was and I didn't know what to tell him. It was very funny. But I mean, there was a lot of that and it actually helped me a lot. But also what I find when I'm looking back at my work, and I also did illustrations of books because of that. I remember we did a whole series of Italian books, which they used for learning the Italian language, and I did that. And I did a lot of different stuff. And then recently I started doing them again. The technology was very different, so it was quite interesting. But I mean, I still think that the cartoons actually also affected the way I paint. And sometimes I still think about doing big, huge paintings, which would look like, you know, I don't know, Renaissance. I mean, there are artists who do that. But I would make them into a cartoonesque kind of way. But I think it allowed me to do certain things, which probably, if I didn't do cartoons, my painting would be much more rigid. And in fact, the colorful side of the paintings and stuff like that, some of them do look a bit cartoonish in a way. But I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or not. But yeah. But yeah, cartoons are very good because they also help you understand a lot of stuff. And also like complex philosophical arguments. I mean, someone once told me, why don't we do a whole book of philosophy just made of cartoons, and not the cartoons like, you know, description, but concepts which will be conveyed by cartoons. You could do that because you could convey paradox, you could convey everything, anything you can imagine. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad that here in this school, in this department, we do a lot of that, and I'm really glad that it's happening here. Yes.
So your drawings and paintings of the flowers.
Yeah.
I was wondering, was that just because you like had a sudden like burst of interest in the flowers?
You know, actually, it's kind of interesting because I think, come to think about it backwards. A couple of years ago, when I was doing my other job here, I met someone, I can't remember her name, but she took me to the botanical, not the botanical gardens, but the zoology department, where they have old botanical gardens in the back. You know, they have what do they call them? You know, they're in glass. And they have these very exotic plants. And I remember looking at them and I kept thinking, because she wanted to do a course, and I don't know whether it ever happened, about botanical drawing. I mean, I'm always fascinated by that stuff, but I mean, I never tried it. And recently I was doing this kind of, and suddenly I thought, well, basically, the question is, I remember since I was a kid, what am I going to draw? What am I going to draw? I don't know what I'm going to draw. I said, okay, let me just sort of, relax, just do whatever comes to mind. So I found myself doing these kind of, floral things. And this was the first one, we started to put name. And obviously you could see some relevant relationship with some of the surrealism where they used to put letters and stuff like that. And I thought, let's keep pushing this. And then I thought this would be great if I do big ones. So I started doing small sketches, and I'm doing a whole series of them. And they started allowing me to do things which I couldn't do before because I used to be so rigid. So I mean, in a way, actually, because well, I don't know whether it was just me, but I know a lot of students who end up doing the human figure all the time. And I didn't want to do the human figure all the time because I thought, why do I keep sort of painting women or whatever? It felt a bit strange. So I thought, why don't you just do flowers? And that's what it is. So, but basically they're more like structures than anything else. But I don't know. I mean, they seem to allow me to do things which I couldn't do before. It's very. But then I started linking it with Spinoza. The whole idea of natura naturans, natura naturata. Partly because I'm writing this book about Giambattista Vico, who lived in the 1600s, and he was also, at that time, he tried to understand how people were looking at reality. And Spinoza, I know Professor Grelnick did a whole series of work based on Spinoza, and I'm really obsessed with Spinoza. So I mean, and also we have one of the major scholars of Spinoza in this university as well. So I mean, Spinoza is someone who I'm really obsessed with. But the whole idea of natura naturata, the nature with the nature, it's the kind of relationship between nature, because he also argued that God is nature. But I mean, once you say that, some people misunderstand it, so you have to go on and on to explain what it. But I mean, suddenly those kind of things, I thought maybe this is how you could convey what natura naturans is without trying to explain it verbally. So we'll see. And as I said, suddenly these became bigger. So again, but you could see the constrictions of when you're trained in a certain way with painting. You have to have the composition right, you have to do this right, you have to do that right. So I mean, you're always going to then, you can't leave it there. You have to push it. And so yeah, so that's why I'm scared of showing it to everyone. But here I am. I'm denuding myself in front of you. This is my work. So. Oh, great, wonderful. Yeah.
I've heard you said tonight. I've heard you say before. Making art is not the same as doing art. Well, I had a recent studio visit, and we talked about it's not what you make, but it's like you shape your practice. And I'm wondering if there's like a correlation there, or if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and thanks for the question, because it does also relate to some of the stuff which Maxine Green wrote about. Maxine Green argues that you could do philosophy rather than just write philosophy, or you just talk philosophy, you do it. And I know I have a problem with the whole idea of making, because it seems so godly with the makers. And I know what people mean, but I mean, I remember having arguments when I was back in grade school of art with colleagues of mine who used to talk a lot about making. It was the time where people were talking about maker spaces and all that stuff. And I said, but making is so almost like pretentious. I don't like it. And also it kind of, now you could disagree with this, and I'm sure I could disagree with it myself. So I kept thinking, the word making is interesting, because in English actually you have making and doing. And doing is not manufacturing, or making is not manufacturing. Making is, but doing is also an action. Doing is also implies that it's part of you. It becomes much more ontological. It's not to do with being, rather than making something. And that's why I keep talking about. So I mean, when Maxine Green talks about doing philosophy, that's what she's talking about. She's talking about philosophy becoming a way of life. Philosophy becoming also part and parcel of what we do. When we talk, we're doing philosophy. When we're engaging with stuff, we're doing philosophy. And same thing with art. You could say, well, actually, whatever we do becomes art, or art could be what we do. So doing is also an act of just walking, and then also there are artists these days, not these days, I mean, there've been artists for a long time now, who actually embody their work by their own being in what they do, in eating or in walking, in being in a space. So I mean, the doing for me does a lot. Doing art does a lot for me, more than just making art, although I do recognize the making. And what I'm worried about the making is it's a bit too romantic, whereas the doing is a bit more, responsible, so to speak. So again, I'm saying this in a very, very brief manner, but there is a really strong argument about that, especially in terms of when we then start talking about learning, teaching, unlearning, and all that stuff. So I mean, and then it becomes more interesting in terms of immersive art, but also more in terms of participatory art. So we're talking about participatory art, suddenly the doing of art becomes really, really central to that. And it helps us understand what participatory art is and its power and its potential in terms of how it can go beyond the normal kind of fetishistic object, which we call the art form and stuff like that. So, yeah. If you want to send me questions, by the way, I mean, I know that you could do that. So please feel free to do that. And I can send you some stuff as well. If you're interested in certain things, there are certain bits and pieces which I can send you as PDFs. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Wow.